Good morning. I'm Gene Eitzen. I'm co-chair along with Cal Sawyer. This is our fourth biennial South Carolina Water Resources Conference. We're really excited. This year we have 340 attendees, and we've had 300 since we began, and it's been a growth each conference, and that's been really an amazing thing. But before we really begin with the program, there's one person I really want to recognize. I'd like all of us to recognize Dawn White and the contribution she makes. She's our conference coordinator. She handles every detail, and I will tell you that as soon as this conference is over, her job begins with the 2016 conference. It is an absolute 2-year process. She stays busy. She just does an amazing job. She handles everything from communication with each of us. She sets up the abstract system. She sets up the registration system, the contribution financial system. She really is the driver for the conference. And Dawn, on behalf of the planning committee and everyone here, we thank you sincerely. Heartfelt thanks for your hard work. I also would like to recognize the Planning Committee. It's been a real joy being part of the Planning Committee from the beginning. And we have a real good time. It's challenging to put together a program that will draw you here and allow you to make the presentations and maintain an academic setting. So what I'd like to do is, for those planning members that are in the audience, would you just please stand so we can recognize you? So when we met this year, the theme of the conference is informing strategic water planning to address natural resource, community, and economic challenges. And this is a really timely topic because we're in the middle of comprehensive statewide water planning. And we really wanted to create both plenary sessions and a conference that really would inform and would add to that. I would like to recognize our major contributors: Clemson University Public Service and Agriculture, Duke Energy, Santee Cooper, Charleston Water System, Greenville Water, Anderson Regional Joint Water System, the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, and YSI. When we started putting the plenary together, we were realizing that there are many challenges not only facing South Carolina as we move forward with how are we going to supply water to every need that we have, but there are national challenges, there are global challenges. And for us, we're a very desirable state to live in, so we will see continued population growth, we'll see continued economic growth, and for those of you that were here yesterday, you got a picture of what the potential could be for economic growth in South Carolina. And it really brings up, it's exciting that the growth could be there, but we really recognize the potential for some really competing demands and conflicting demands for water resources. We continue to experience recurring droughts, and we need to continue working on our drought preparedness because eventually we're going to really define those water use priorities and how we're going to address those during these extended droughts. How are we going to minimize the impact, and how can we better predict the impact of land use changes on our water resources? We have to think about the advent now of big data, new technologies that really will be revolutionary in the way that we manage and monitor and manage the data. And it will afford us the opportunity for rapid decision making that we haven't had in the past. We really will be dealing with climate alteration. We don't really know what it will be, but as we develop this plan, we have to have some means to work with that. And from an ecological standpoint, one thing that's near and dear to me is how will we maintain sustainability and diversity in our rivers, the environmental flows, et cetera, that are needed to do that. We all recognize, and yesterday's plenary particularly brought forward the concept that we need large-scale collaboration. And that really is across the board, collaboration among many stakeholders. if we are going to be informed to develop and implement a statewide water plan that really is beneficial, both, well, throughout economy, society, and environment. And as we heard yesterday, that conversation is important because that dialogue will inform, will bring up issues that are really important that we need to be developing into the overall water plan. We tried to kickstart this conversation in 2008, and that's one of the reasons that we have developed this conference. It really has brought together so many people, and I think I'm certainly not alone in having enjoyed the research exchange, educational information, just getting to know my colleagues, you know, and the universities coming together, and that's been a real joy. And I think we've gained a strong appreciation of what each other are doing and trying to share it. So we're not the first state, obviously, that's working on a comprehensive water plan, you know, to address our long-term water needs. If you look through and do a search of where the states are, you'll see that a number of states are in the process of planning. There are a few states that have gone through that and have developed a plan. And I guess part of the question will be, is there a blueprint that we have found that's really going to guide us in our efforts? And ultimately, we're going to be looking at regional water planning, and I think that how do you fold that together into a comprehensive water plan? That's really going to be the challenge. Interesting, yesterday in the conversation, issues were brought up. How do we forecast? How far do we plan ahead? You know, what's the population going to be in 10 years and 20 years? Where's that growth going to be? It certainly, we don't expect homogeneous growth throughout the state. There are going to be hot spots, and how are we going to deliver water and resource needs in those particular areas? And I think how are we going to implement new technologies? How are we going to price water? All of these issues came up yesterday. And I think that's really the challenge I look to everyone. In developing the plenaries, we asked the panelists to think about several things. And again, yesterday I asked you to think about those same things. What are the major challenges that we're facing? What are the major issues? If you don't hear it today, please, during the question and answers period, bring that forward. We need to hear those. And if there are specific issues that are concerned for your economic sector, we need to hear that. Again, do you have recommendations on the framework that you would like to share with our colleagues here? They have a huge task ahead in developing the plan. And we really asked the legislature yesterday, are we going to be able in this state to allocate the funds we need to really develop and implement that water plan? So far, the money that's been allocated in South Carolina is quite low compared to other states that have completed this process. And when we talk about conservation, one of the things we have to keep in mind is our infrastructure. We have a lot of issues with our water delivery, wastewater infrastructure, and how are we going to address that? The latest tab was it's approximately a $2 billion cost to move that forward. So as we begin the panelist discussion this morning, we'll use the same framework we used yesterday. We're asking each panelist to provide individual remarks. We ask them to speak for up to 8 minutes with their remarks. We're going to hold all questions until the end, and once all the panelists are completed with their individual remarks, we'll open up the questions to the floor. So I'm really pleased to introduce the panelists. We have, as we did yesterday, today we have an exceptional group of people here. Kenron Tiers, South Carolina Department of DNR. David is with us with South Carolina DHEC, and then Chris is representing EPA. And Ken is Deputy Director for Land, Water, and Conservation. David, of course, we know is our Bureau Chief. And then Chris is the branch chief for pollution control and implementation at Region 4. So these are our regulatory guys. And then we wanted a nonprofit panel to be representing as much as possible the entire state. So we looked at the state from upstate, mid-state, and in the coastal area. And we really do have an excellent panel. We're very excited that they agreed to be here. Heather is here, Heather Nix, Upstate Forever. She's Director of Clean Air and Water Program there. Then we have Mark Robertson, Nature Conservancy. He's the Director here in South Carolina. Eric Kruger, he's with the Nature Conservancy, and he's Director of Science and Stewardship. We have Dana Beach, who's here with us. He's the Executive Director, Coastal Conservation League. And then Hamilton Davis, who's Director of the Energy and Climate section of Coastal Conservation League. We're very excited you're here today. I think we're going to have a wonderful discussion. So we'll do as we did yesterday. We're going to open with the regulatory comments, and then we'll go to the nonprofit sector. So Ken, would you kick us off, please?
Thank you, Gene. Good morning, everybody. Glad to see a good crowd here early on Thursday morning. First of all, I want to start by thanking Clemson for putting on really the premier water conference in the state. Every time I've been here, I've learned a lot. The format that they use is outstanding. They bring together a group of stakeholders that we don't often have together in one room, so I really appreciate that. Excellent job, Vice President Askew. Appreciate your involvement in that as well. You've got a great team there at Clemson, so we appreciate it. You know, when we were preparing for this, we were sent several questions that Gene referred to, and I thought I would just kind of go down the list. And the first question, of course, involves the major challenges and most important issues we're facing. And it is a rather daunting task when we're trying to take on this kind of project with fairly minimal funding. And I would say that's probably the biggest challenge, is a stable source of funding. At the department, it's hard to plan when you don't know exactly what you have to plan with. And so that's something we've been talking with the legislature a good bit about, and we're hopeful we're making some inroads on that. And you know, one of the issues for me is getting a sound science foundation, getting this good assessment done, the modeling that we're getting ready to do, knowing what we have in the bank, essentially. That is really key. But the 2000 State Water Plan that was prepared by DNR had 81 recommendations for effectively managing and protecting our water resources, all sound and solid recommendations. And I would venture to say that if you look at that document, everyone in this room would agree with all or most of those recommendations. And it's not that the ideas in the plan are bad ideas or the plan is overreaching. It's just that there hasn't been the support to implement the ideas, meaning there hasn't been funding and resources devoted to it. And that's partly because there's so many other issues that our legislators have been dealing with. But I believe that has changed in recent years. The past 15 years, we've seen a majority of those years in some sort of drought. And that, unfortunately, that situation focuses the need to deal with these issues in a positive way. Our population has more than doubled since 1960. There are uncertainties related to climate change. Atlanta almost ran out of water several years ago. North Carolina is having groundwater availability problems and is well on its way to developing regional water plans. The fact that our legislature did fund this modeling effort does speak to me of a little bit of a sea change in the thinking on this. You know, when I came on board with DNR 5 years ago and we had a 60% budget cut, I never thought we'd be at the point we are today where we actually have some money to bring to the table to get some of this work done. So, you know, some of the key recommendations in the 2004 water plan, just for example, are the need for surface water permitting program. That's been done. All of this has been done kind of through a piecemeal process. The need for minimum in-stream flow requirements. We fought very hard for that in the permitting bill. That was important, and it's in there. The need to expand our monitoring networks, we've done that with the help of USGS and others. So that's coming along well. That was part of the 2004 effort. To establish formal mechanisms with Georgia and North Carolina to promote interstate coordination, that's happening. The need for a coastal plain groundwater flow model, that's happened. It needs to be updated, but at least it's a starting point. We're not starting from scratch. And for regional water planning, well, that's what we're getting into right now. And we look at the state water plan process as a 5-step process. First, development of surface water models. Next, development of groundwater models. Third, development of water demand projections. And once these data and models are developed, development of regional water plans. And finally, the development of the new state water plan based on information and recommendations provided in the regional plans. So, we're currently working with DHEC and CDM Smith, our contractor, in developing surface water models for the 8 river basins in the state. Now, the idea is to have this completed in 2 years. That's an aggressive schedule. We're going to try to adhere to it. We're starting in the Saluda Basin as a pilot. We'll quickly move to the Edisto and the Broad. We hope to have the Saluda done by May and all of them done by August of 2016. You know, DHEC has also shored up their reporting act, so we're collecting good data on water use in the state, and that's very helpful. And so the question, who will be doing the planning? You know, we believe it should be stakeholder driven. We believe the state should provide oversight, data, and information, and should be capable of applying these surface water and groundwater models to test what-if scenarios and resolve water disputes for the planners and stakeholders. But we believe the plan should be crafted essentially by the stakeholders in that regional basin. We believe there should be a dedicated group of stakeholders for each basin, such as a regional water planning group or a basin advisory group, similar to what we've already done in the Savannah River Basin. And that's really a good model. Essentially, it was a coalition of the willing that we brought together to try to deal with all of those issues, especially the drought management in the lakes. And you know, that's the first time, to my knowledge, that an advisory council in South Carolina has had direct input on the models and the alternative scenarios that are being run through those models. They had the chance to do that, they did it, and it's working. So, you know, once we get through all of this, a couple of very important questions arise. Once completed, how do we implement the regional plans? As you might know, the 1998 and 2004 plans were not actually adopted by the legislature as official state water plans. So is it going to sit on the shelf again, or are we going to have some action and actually have some teeth in this? Very important question. And how do we enforce it? Do you use a carrot, a stick? Do you withhold grants if they don't comply with the water plan? Not sure how that's all going to roll out, but important questions. So in our mind, the state water plan, once we get to that point, it's going to basically include an assessment of the overall condition of water resources of the state, a summary and evaluation of statewide trends in water use, water demand, and water availability, new water resource policy and program recommendations, a list prioritizing water resource needs of the state, recommendations on innovative practices, and ideas on the integration of water resource management. That's a lot to accomplish in what we envision as about a 5-year process. And as stated in the 2004 water plan, the effective management of South Carolina's water resources is really beyond the scope of any one agency or organization. So as has been mentioned quite a bit today, collaboration is key. We're doing that. We're working with our sister agency, DHEC, probably closer than we ever have before. And that's a good thing for the state. We're reaching out to the Corps of Engineers, for instance. They have a program known as the Planning Assistance to States. It's a force multiplier for us. They're very interested in helping us with some of the issues that we're dealing with. The USDA, my former agency, has expressed great interest in helping us with this as well. EPA, of course, will have a role, NOAA, and others. So we are collaborating. We intend to reach out to everybody we can think of. If any of you have ideas, please give them to me. So that's kind of my answer to the first question. You know, the next question was, how can we as state as a state, allocate financial resources to fund development and implementation of a statewide water plan? Well, we believe it's the responsibility of the state to provide funding to collect data and generate information necessary to develop the plans, and to provide funding to develop the regional water plans. But we do not believe that it is the responsibility of the state to provide funding for every project proposed in these plans. Once the technical information is provided by the state, and once the what-if scenarios are run by the state and the regional plans are developed with oversight from the state, it will mainly be the responsibility of the users and stakeholders to fund new projects, such as in case of the need for an impoundment, that kind of thing. And the new projects, of course, must adhere to the guidelines and rules established in the water plan. The third question, as leaders, you often need to seek consensus. What are your thoughts and recommendations on developing a participation framework for the statewide water plan, and should we involve our neighboring states? Well, during the public workshop that we held about a year ago, one thing was clear. People wanted to be able to participate, and they wanted to be kept informed. By participation, they wanted to have input into the process and wanted their questions addressed. So we will engage a facilitator to oversee this process. I envision using technology also to complement the usual format of meetings with things like webinars, virtual classroom sessions, our DNR and DHEC websites, roundtable discussion sessions with a wide variety of groups, educational outreach similar to what Clemson has done with Carolina Clear and some of their other successful programs that leverage new technology and information blasts that really can get the word out. And I'll also say that any of you are welcome at any time to call, come by, set up a meeting, send an anonymous note, however you wish to communicate. If you have concerns, I want to hear them. Door's always open. So remember that, please. And we should involve our neighbors in North Carolina and Georgia. You know, for example, in developing the surface water models, we'll have to work with Georgia to ensure that our inflow data sets and water use data are consistent. We'll have to work to use the inflow data sets that North Carolina is developing for the Broad, Catawba, and PD, headwaters up there. And it's very important that we establish good relationships with our neighbors, and we're doing that. I think we're probably working closer with Georgia through the Savannah River Basin study than we ever have. In North Carolina, we have an excellent relationship. Tom Franson and I, my counterpart up there in North Carolina, talk all the time. He is very willing to provide us with this data, so that's going well. I participate in the Interstate Council on Water Policy, which is folks from all over the country, most of them well ahead of where we are in the modeling and the water planning projects, and I've learned quite a great deal from them, and most of them are very forthcoming in helping us with making that next step forward. The final question that was posed was, how can we provide funding for replacement of aging water infrastructure, as South Carolina is reported to have $1.6 billion in drinking water infrastructure needs over the next 20 years and $566 million in wastewater infrastructure needs, and that may be a conservative estimate. Now, that challenge is an enormous challenge, especially with federal funding on decline. You know, while I recognize the difficulties of the old standard of a grant and loan package that I was involved with as a young Senate staffer in my early career, dozens of water and sewer upgrade projects, and I was always concerned even the small projects had this enormous price tag on them. That's only getting worse and going up. So the challenge of that funding is going to have to be born. As Senator Verdon mentioned yesterday, we're going to have to look at rate structure and appropriate pricing. I mean, that's not a popular thing to say, but the fact is it's got to be paid for in somewhere. And, you know, if we can gain efficiencies even of 20% in lost water supply by upgrading our facilities and infrastructure, it's worth the investment. So I guess I'll end by just saying, you know, there's a lot of talented people in this room and others that work in the water resources area. If we pull together and actually work together and collaborate, we can make a lasting positive impact on this state. So I ask you to help me do it together. Thank you.
David?
Thank you. Good morning. And Just a few comments to start with. First off, Dr. Idson, Dr. Sawyer, thank you. Dawn, for what a great conference. You know, as a avid Gamecock fan, especially during football season, it's kind of tough to recognize Clemson. But, you know, not only is the Clemson football team doing so great this year, better than Carolina, the team for this conference from Clemson has just done an outstanding job. So, again, congratulations to the team. What happened with Ken up here is what I feared may happen. Ken and I and David Bays and others with Ken's group have been working so closely together for the last 3 or 4 years on this effort that really I can almost just stand up here and shorten mine very quickly and say what Ken said, ditto, and I can move us along pretty quickly. But I'll add just a couple of thoughts to it from DHEC's perspective. One, and I won't go through and read all the questions again, y'all know them by now, but one, what's needed for water planning? Good science. We need good science. And I think we are all moving in that direction, whether it's the new modeling effort that's being started with DNR and DHEC and our contractor that we hired, CDM Smith. And I hope some of you got to hear the presentation by both Ken and the representative from CDM Smith yesterday. It gave a lot more meat to that process. And as Ken indicated, we're open to input on that. If anyone has things they want to share with us, we want to hear it. As you're going through that science process, you need good data in that modeling process. We have a lot of good data at DHEC that we've gathered over the years. As Ken indicated, it's gotten better and better with specific requirements. But we're also going to be reaching out to the water users now for their data as well. So we ask for your support in that. The water users that have information to share with us, we look forward to getting that and working it in the process. The USGS gauging stations, the data we get there, the new technologies that are being developed, the intelligent river technology, all those are going to be important players as we move forward in water management in South Carolina. But again, getting that science basis to start with, I think, is very important. Moving on just a little bit to the issue of how do we keep this thing going, the financial piece of it, if you will. Yeah, we got some money, and you know, it's hard to say $1.5 million isn't a lot of money. You know, for me, it's a lot of money, but it's not going to be enough to sustain everything throughout. You know, I would like to recognize the leadership from our legislature that you heard from yesterday. I'd also like to recognize the leadership from both DHEC with Director Templeton and from DNR with Director Taylor, who saw the need for having this science-based approach and collectively went forward and secured the money to start with. And then, of course, the second piece of it is the stakeholder piece, bringing in everyone, getting everyone involved, whether it's from a statewide standpoint or, as Ken mentioned, as we develop specific river basin advisory groups, much like we did in the Savannah River Basin, the recognition that we need money to get that started with, and although it's only $100,000, I think, Ken, to get started, it is a start, and that's what we're looking forward to, that step as well. You know, we have had some good foresight in South Carolina. Again, whether it's enforcing our laws and regulations on getting data submitted to DHEC, passage of the new Surface Water Permitting Act. And it's hard for me to believe, but it's been now 3 years since that act was passed and 2 years since the regulations were developed. I'm pleased to say that at DHEC we have issued all around 200 of the existing surface water permits. They're out there now. We've got about 114 existing ag registrations that are covered by that act as well. We've had 4 new ones. Most of them come with controversy, but we've got them. And so we're making a lot of progress, but of course we've got a long ways to go. Now, as far as our relationship with our neighboring states and their involvement in planning in South Carolina, of course we are the receiver from water coming down from North Carolina and a couple major basins. And then we share, of course, one of the largest basins, 10,000 square miles, Savannah River, with our sister state of Georgia. Each one of those come with challenges. Some of them have led to some very hard discussions. In some cases, you heard yesterday, some litigation with North Carolina about making sure that there's recognition of equity between the states. Each state has to be involved as decisions are being made that impacts those waterways. So I think that dialogue is important. We do have a great dialogue, as Ken said, especially with our colleagues in both of those states and sharing data. But as important decisions are made from a water management standpoint in those shared waters, it's going to be important to increase that collaboration between the states. I'll end in talking just real quickly about the idea of money for infrastructure. No one is really kind of, well, I'll have to say it. I was getting ready to say no one but DHEC is more aware of what that infrastructure need is. All the water utilities that are represented here at this meeting know that as well. And I'd like to reach out to those water utilities and recognize them for the work that they do. Even though there's infrastructure needs, our water utilities in our state do an incredible job. As a matter of fact, as we partner with them in our regulatory status, we have one of the highest compliance rates for drinking water, not just in the Southeast, but nationally, in the 99% range, which to me is incredible. It's very envious to the other states in the country, which I think is good. But every day our infrastructure ages, and every day we need to invest in it. And y'all have heard the dollar amounts, you know, tremendous dollar amounts on both the water and the wastewater side. And yes, those estimates may be conservative. We've got some vehicles out there. We operate a state revolving fund. It's got a lot of money that's available for low interest rates for projects. There's the Rural Infrastructure Fund that's administered by the Rural Infrastructure Authority. But those are small amounts when you compare it to the overall need. So really, you know, as Ken indicated and as you heard from our legislative folks yesterday, really it comes down to what the consumers will support, and they need to support, just like we do for other commodities that we use, the monies to upgrade our infrastructures. So I'll end real quickly again, echoing a lot of things Ken said, but open it up with what Ken closed with as well. We've got a lot of talented people in our state. We, with the regulatory agencies, have good ideas, but we don't have all the good ideas. And we really do want to hear from each and every one as we're going through both the science process, the planning process, and if it's not a buy-in, if it's not ownership by everyone, we won't be successful, and that's what we want. Our doors are open at DHEC as well. Anyone has any thoughts or ideas, please just reach out to me. We'd love to hear them. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Chris?
I'm Chris Thomas, and I'm with EPA Region 4, Chief of our Pollution Control and Implementation Branch, and thank you for inviting us up here. The State Water Plan is a state product. It's something that we're interested in watching, but from our perspective, it is a state product, and it's something that is for the state. From an EPA perspective, we're interested in water quality, the issues of the Clean Water Act, and DHEC is authorized to administer the programs of the Clean Water Act, and really that's where our primary interests lie. Is the designated uses of in the state water quality standards. You know, we certainly encourage and expect to see those water quality standards and designated uses to be considered in the state water plan as y'all deal with quantity. Water quality and water quantity are really, you can't separate the two. And as water professionals, y'all, I'm kind of preaching to the choir here. You know, the title of the conference here being Strategic Water Planning to Address Natural Resource, Community, and Economic Challenges. You've got to have all three of those. The natural resource piece, the community piece, the social piece, and the economic opportunities really, I think, is a better way to say that. Water, I think, across the country is probably one of the most underappreciated things that we've got. And South Carolina is blessed with a lot of really good water quality resources from a quantity and quality standpoint. You look across the different sectors of the state, the people that use water. You know, everybody needs it, and we take it for granted so often. And I really think as we move forward as water professionals, we're going to have to figure out a better way in our communication to people that don't deal with water every day, the importance and value of water, that water has to society, whether they're really aware of it or not, and the value of the environment that's out there. There was a 2009 study by the Moore Business School here at University of South Carolina that showed that the natural resources contribute $30 billion to the state's economy and are responsible for 230,000 jobs. And that's a study done by the University of South Carolina, you know, on your own state, by your own people. And for a state that has a population of about 4.5 million people, that's huge. I mean, again, $30 billion to the state's economy and responsible for 230,000 jobs. And so I think if we can learn to communicate the value of water and the value of our natural resources to the public, to the politicians, the people that make the decisions that govern, you know, what happens and how these things come together, we actually have a very strong statement to make. And so, you know, and again, that gets back to water quantity management as well as water quality, because you can have the quantity without the quality, and you're certainly not going to have $30 billion of economic impact. You got to have both. So again, as y'all come together as a state to pull this water plan together, I'm encouraged to hear, you know, the basin approach, watershed approach, which from our perspective, you know, that's really what we, especially in Region 4, have been pushing for many years. Jim Jatina, my supervisor, has really been a champion of that within the region and nationally, and I think a lot of people in other places in the country are really paying a lot more attention to what the states in the Southeast are doing, using the watershed approach for water quality and water quantity decisions. You've got to do it that way. I think as you move forward, there's the success of your water planning efforts. Really, I don't believe are going to be a function of the science. I go to a lot of these kinds of conferences, and I was looking at the agenda and all the different topics. It's impressive. You know, the state of South Carolina, y'all have got so much going on. You've got some very you know, world-class scientists and engineers working on these problems. I don't think the science piece of it and the engineering piece is going to be what decides the success or the failure of your ultimate plan. I think the things that David and Ken were referring to about the engagement of all the stakeholders, I really encourage y'all to focus on that piece, because everybody's got to come together. The municipalities, the ag interests, the industrial side of things, the people. That everybody's interests have to be represented in the water plan, and you know, and the stakeholders themselves have got to be open and honest about what their needs are, about what their interests are, and put everything out on the table, and then collectively as a state family figure out how to work it to where everybody's needs are met. There are times when farmers might need water that's real critical, and it's important to take care of those needs. It's important for certain industrial sectors to have water at certain times, and so all of those things coming together is really what this effort's about. I think, you know, and I encourage you to be bold, to think big and to think long term. I think a lot of times these efforts are not commensurate with what you're trying to do, and so I think the real danger is probably thinking too small and thinking too short term. There's always going to be people in the state of South Carolina. And the water resources are finite. And as we realize the assimilative capacities of many of the waters are being reached, and that brings a whole host of water quality and regulatory decisions through the NPDES program. There are places where the water quantity assimilative capacities, or not assimilative capacities, but the sustainability of the use of those waters are being reached. And so that brings a whole different set of consequences. The word sustainability, we've heard and we banner it around, but it's really, really important, because if you're making decisions that are not sustainable, ultimately somebody or something or some organism or some part of the environment or the natural world is going to suffer. And we've just got to do everything we can to manage the water resources that we've been blessed with in a way that meets all of those needs, and I think we can do that. You know, the word sustainable sometimes to some people carries this environmental community label, but really I think it's a stolen word from the ag community. The ag community for a long time has talked about good stewardship, and I think sustainability is just another word trying to describe that same concept of stewardship. So if you kind of cringe a little bit at the word sustainable or sustainability, just substitute in stewardship and you'll probably feel a little better. The last thing that I'm gonna leave you with is from a regulatory perspective. You know, information, we always say information is your friend. It is so important for the regulators and for the people who manage the plan to have good information. And my observation is as I've seen water plans implemented in other states, some body, person or entity at the state will ultimately be given the responsibility, either in parses or in pieces or in parts or in total, to implement a water plan. So often they're not given enough information. And so I would encourage y'all on the accountability side of whatever you come up with to make sure that the people making the decisions have enough information. And it's kind of like trying to balance a checkbook without all the checks. You just can't do it. And ultimately, somebody at the end of the day is expected to balance that checkbook, but if they don't have all the information, they don't know where all the withdrawals from that checkbook have gone, there's no way they can really do that. So with that, good luck, and we'll be watching, and however we can help, you know, that's what we want to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really informative. We've been wanting to hear the information that you gave us. You know, we've been talking about stakeholders, and we've been talking about how are the voices going to be heard. And we're really honored today to have three very important groups with us today. Collectively, they have many members that speak to them, and we would like to hear their voices in terms of where they think we are, where we're going. And Heather, would you kick us off?
Hey there. Well, thank you to Dr. Eidson and to the whole planning team, and to also all of the presenters. I saw some really great presentations yesterday and appreciate everyone's hard work in putting all of those together. I'm Heather Nix, and I direct the Clean Air and Water program at Upstate Forever. In case you're not familiar with Upstate Forever, we are a conservation-focused, membership-based nonprofit. Our mission is to protect special places and promote sensible growth within the 10-county upstate region. So I went a little bit off track today from, you've heard a lot of kind of similar answers, I think, and I'm going to expand a little bit beyond just the plan that we're working on now. Obviously, everyone here understands that we face major challenges to both our water supply and our water quality. And from my perspective, our focus should be on several main issues and solutions. I'm so glad to hear all of the conversations about the stakeholder input that will happen with the surface water assessment project. We're really glad that South Carolina has finally put some funding towards making this work happen. And now it's obviously up to the agencies to make sure that the end result is the best that it can be. So no pressure, guys. Providing a stakeholder process is crucial to be sure that that product integrates many perspectives and is useful on the ground. But beyond that, and I'm glad this was also mentioned today as well, we need to collaborate with our neighboring states to proactively solve potential disagreements with them and hopefully avoid more costly legal battles. The hardest part of any planning, though, is that once it's completed, it actually needs to be implemented. We need to improve the Surface Water Withdrawal Act to require controls on all large water users that will ensure compliance not just with the water plan, but that will also protect in-stream flows, especially during periods of drought. DNR does a tremendous amount of work on water quantity issues, and they should be consulted about proposed withdrawal permits. Switching gears a little bit to talk about water quality issues, we need to increase the amount of water quality monitoring that happens. Funding cuts over the years have resulted in DHEC monitoring only about 40% of the named streams in the upstate. Of those monitored streams, almost 3/4 of them are not meeting the state's water quality standards in at least one area. It's a pretty safe bet that many of the 60% of our named streams that are not being monitored also have water quality issues, and it's important that we at least have some basic knowledge about where and how severe those issues are. We also need to put more emphasis on improving water quality in our impaired streams. While I certainly acknowledge and very much appreciate the hard work by many DHEC staff on this issue, we need more resources focused on it. Many of the TMDLs that have been developed and approved in the upstate have not been successful, even though they may have been in place for several years, some of them up to 10 or 15 years. We really need to start meeting our water quality standards. We all know for many reasons poor water quality is bad, is unhealthy for a variety of things. It's also really bad for the economy, and we need to just work on fixing it. In the meantime, while we work on fixing it, a benchmark to evaluate if our waters are safe for secondary recreation could be very beneficial. While primary recreation or swimming should certainly continue to be the goal and the regulatory standard for all of South Carolina's waters, having a secondary recreation benchmark would allow us to evaluate if streams are safe for non-immersion recreation. In many cases, local governments are hesitant to encourage any water activities if DHEC has deemed the water impaired for recreation. With so much potential for and interest in blueway trails throughout the state, we need to have a clear process to evaluate what waters are safe for paddling, even if they're not yet safe for swimming. There are tremendous economic benefits to blueway trails, and currently we're not taking full advantage of those. And lastly, and in my opinion, the most important issue that impacts our water resources is growth. Projections show that South Carolina will add 1 million new residents over the next 20 years, and how we accommodate that new growth is crucial to the future of our water. While Greenville-Spartanburg has a lot of tremendous assets and are fantastic places to be, unfortunately, we've also consistently been ranked as one of the most sprawling areas throughout the country. While there are various reasons for this, one contributing factor is that in many cases, our development regulations encourage the lower density development typical of sprawl. When we only focus on the stormwater impacts from a site scale, lower density development may appear to have less of an impact. But when we step back and look at a more broader scale, accommodating new growth with more compact development can significantly reduce stormwater impacts. A recent Clemson and Upstate Forever study showed that the stormwater impacts from 2 different growth scenarios for Greenville County. The results were clear. While both scenarios accommodated the same number of single-family houses, the compact development produced half the stormwater runoff and half the pollutants as the sprawling scenario. In addition to the direct stormwater reductions, growing more compactly also reduces our water and energy needs. While there certainly are others here who can speak more directly and have mentioned this, studies across the country have shown that providing water and electricity throughout a larger grid results in inefficiencies. We could conserve water and electricity by encouraging development to locate within existing urban areas rather than in more remote locations. As was also mentioned yesterday, the cost estimates for replacing our aging water infrastructure are staggering. The American Society of Civil Engineers estimates that South Carolina has $2.2 billion worth of drinking and wastewater infrastructure needs over the next 20 years. It's clear that we need to focus on reducing these costs and providing services more efficiently so that we can afford the repairs and maintenance, and also so that we don't leave an even bigger repair and maintenance bill to future generations. Simply encouraging more compact development can not only protect water resources and reduce stormwater impacts, it can also improve air quality, reduce the cost of providing utilities and emergency services while also increasing their efficiencies and emergency response times. It can reduce transportation infrastructure needs and costs and support multimodal transportation options such as public transit, walking, and biking. All of these things help reduce the stormwater impacts from that additional infrastructure that we would need. While my perspective is from the upstate region, I believe that these actions will benefit water resources across the state, and I look forward to ongoing discussions with many of you about how to implement and improve these ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Mark?
Thank you. I'm very grateful to Clemson University, Dr. Eidson, for organizing this conference. It's really great to bring together so many people around the state that are interested in water resources and working on these issues. So I'm Mark Robertson, and I'm the State Director for the Nature Conservancy here in South Carolina. I want to start out a little bit about why we're here. Why is the Nature Conservancy here? Those of you that know us may think more of our history as an organization, a nonprofit that works on land issues, buying land for parks and wildlife areas, recreation areas. But about 15 years ago, the Nature Conservancy made a strategic commitment to directly address the conservation of freshwater resources, and not just as a side benefit of land conservation. We all know the obvious connection between land use and water resources, and we recognize that our work in land conservation was benefiting water resources, but we made a decision about 15 years ago to get into it directly. A major focus of our early work was on the operation of big dams around the world, and not just in the United States. And for dozens of dams, we've been able to help create and be part of collaborative processes with stakeholders and other stakeholders who have vital interest in water, to rework dam operations so that the natural resources of the rivers are substantially improved and without sacrificing the other services that those rivers provide to people. That initial focus has broadened so that today we're working on water use planning for river basins, states, and entire countries. We're working on the design and placement of large new dams in places like Africa and China. And we're working to incorporate natural infrastructure into water supply and water use plans. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, and my colleague Eric Krieger will talk about that. So you've heard all the speakers say that anything having to do with state water planning has to be collaborative. We agree. We believe in that. We've implemented that, and we've tried to live that in our work on water resources. A couple examples here from South Carolina. One is the FERC relicensing of the Lake Murray Saluda River Dam, not far from here in Columbia, that took place a few years ago. We helped organize a collaborative process on that with many of the stakeholders. Our interest was what's going to happen to the downstream natural resources, places like Congaree National Park, the only national park in South Carolina. And so we started out helping to design a process that was very collaborative, brought everybody in. First couple meetings, all the SCE&G engineers and planners sat over here, all the environmental groups sat over here, people from the city of Columbia sat over here. They all kind of looked sideways at each other, why are we all in the same room together on this process? But over time, it really evolved to a very collaborative process where there was really strong collaboration among all those experts to come up with win-win solutions for how that dam can be managed and operated to the benefit of all of the stakeholders and all the interests in the room. And I think it was a great example of coming up with a way of approaching these water problems that does emphasize collaboration. We are also, as mentioned a couple times, the work going on in the Savannah River. We are a partner there. We're actually a cost share partner along with the state of South Carolina and the state of Georgia, and we're contributing money and in-kind staff services to the reevaluation of the dam operations. There, all the dams on the Savannah are owned and operated by the Army Corps of Engineers, not all of them, but all the big ones. SCNG has a dam there too. But the big ones that really control the river flow, 3 big dams, are owned and operated by the Corps. And so we've been a cost share partner to help come up with a new plan of how those dams are operated under drought conditions. Because the drought of record occurred not too long ago, just a few years ago, and the last drought plan was written long before that year. So, and has been mentioned, has been successful bringing in a lot of the stakeholders, the people who live around the lakes upstream, the people who operate the water utilities downstream of the dams, and it's been very successful getting them all in the room, and I think it's a good model. So part of our approach as a conservation group is to make sure that when we're in these processes that, you know, we're thinking about all the uses, and we're also thinking about the well-documented value of natural rivers, lakes, and streams as valuable resources in and of themselves. They're not just big tanks where we can all stick in a straw and take out as much water as we want, but they actually have intrinsic values. And I think in this room, people understand that. The good news is that that can be done. You know, it is possible to come up with a plan that sort of really results in some win-win situations and reasonable agreements that manage resources for all their values. Chris, you referred to the recent study by the Moore School on the value of natural resources here. I think the figure was $30 billion annual revenue from natural resource activities in the state. A lot of that is related to water. A lot of that is related to our coast, to our rivers, to our major lakes. And so a lot of that natural resource value is tied to water. And so thinking about our rivers and resources as important and intrinsic value in and of themselves is part of what we have to plan for. So this conference is talking a lot about statewide water planning. I think there have been some legitimate concerns about, gosh, how can we afford to do that and where the money's going to come from? I would turn that question around. How can we not afford to do a state water plan? How can we afford not to do that? All right? I think we have no choice, and so we have to find the money, and we have to work together on that. Many of you in this room, like me, I have a board. We have a board in Nature Conservancy here in South Carolina of about 17 community and state leaders, all of whom, you know, are very engaged on these issues. Many of you may work at a water utility or an agency that has a board. Those are constituents. All those board members, all of us in the room are constituents for a statewide water plan. And you know, we have to be involved in the stakeholder process. We also have to be involved in the legislative process of helping to find the resources. The money will probably flow through the budgets of DNR and DHEC, but all of us have constituents that we can work with to make sure that happens. And I would suggest that's just as important to set up the money and get the process underway as it is to be at the table when the water plans themselves. If we wait till that point, we haven't done our job. We have to be involved earlier in the process. So I would say we don't have any choice but to do this. And in thinking about the costs, it's important to think about this in stages. Ken and Dave did a really good job of describing where we are today. We're doing the assessments. And the assessments are an evaluation of how much water do we have, what are the existing uses, in creating a tool, a model essentially that allows us to create projections and scenarios of the future. Okay, that's an important stage. It takes a certain amount of money. That comes before we do a plan. And so we can break this down into pieces. I think it's also important to think about how we can learn from what other states have done to be economical about this. There's been a lot of discussion of how much did it cost in Georgia to do this? Well, they took a particular approach, and I think we can learn from that and maybe improve upon it. I would also point out that Georgia is twice as big as South Carolina. Thanks to Google, I looked this up while a couple people were speaking, but Georgia is 38 million acres, South Carolina, 20 million acres. It's almost twice as big, all right? Population-wise, Georgia, 10 million people. South Carolina, 4.8 million. So, we have a different scale of work in front of us, and I think we need to think about that carefully, and as I said, break it down into parts. The part we're at now is the assessment. Let's work on getting the funding for that and get that done. And then we move to the next stage, which is the actual planning. And we're committed to be part of that. We've been in the legislature. I spoke about the need for all of us to do that. I would be remiss to not recognize our Director of Government Relations, April Donnelly, who's over here. April has been active in the legislature last year and the year before, helping, assisting and working with DNR and DHEC to work with our representatives, to make our elected officials to make sure that the funding is available for this. And I think all of you have that same opportunity to participate in this process. So, Gene, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Eric Krieger, and thank you very much.
Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Eric Krieger. I'm the Director of Science and Stewardship for the South Carolina chapter of the Nature Conservancy. And I've been working in South Carolina for about 12 years on water issues of various types. And I've always been impressed by how much can be done by collaborating with each other in the state on these really major problems. And so anyway, this morning I'm going to try to introduce a couple of different points so that I'm not just parroting everything that everybody else has been saying. But before I do that, I would like to say that we really do support the concepts of collaboration in developing the state water plan. We've seen it work in other places. I spent a lot of weeks and days working on hydropower relicensings, both in the Congaree-Saluda systems and in the PD system in North Carolina as it affects South Carolina. And I've really been impressed by how people can come together, dissolve perceived differences, and really find those win-win solutions and work together on things. And I think hopefully all of us have had some experiences like that where we really feel like it can work and that we can come together from different sectors and really believe that we can get things done, because we have seen it work. We've seen it work on very large systems, very thorny and large problems, and with 50-year and similar time horizons. So where you really are talking about something that is on the scale of the problem and projecting out into the future. And of course, inherent in that too, which will echo on some other comments too, is really the use and necessity of strong science in that. And I think we don't disagree with that. I really like the point that Chris made about, we do have the science, we do have the technology, and I think if we stop and ponder that a second, I think we all believe that that's so. And really, when you look at what's gone on with with raising the money for the assessment and the amount of discussion and forum that have arisen for talking about the plan, it really looks like the willingness and the enthusiasm and all that is there. And it really will come down to stakeholders working together to find common ground and hammer out win-win solutions for water management. So anyway, we support those things and don't want to belabor on those too much. One thing I would like to bring into the conversation, and really this is a seed right now, and this is more for the future when the plan and the assessment actually gets into the planning, moves off the basic analysis and starts moving into the planning phase. But coming back to the issues of the natural values of our water systems, they do have that economic output. They do have those intrinsic and aesthetic values that satisfy us all in certain ways that sometimes evade dollar values. I would just like to impress on everybody that there are ways to work those kinds of concerns into water plans and ways to articulate the science around those principles that will help us make good decisions in water planning. Now, I'm not for a moment naive enough to think that if there's one glass of water left in a river and somebody needs a drink, it's going to get drunk. So we know that. But well ahead of that, we can make good decisions for our natural values in our streams and wetlands and lakes. Well ahead of that, we can apply better science to at least figure out where the boundaries are in general. And we can use the expertise that we have in the room. We can use a lot of science that's already been developed. We also support the concept that there may be some additional work that does need to be done, and we feel that is a very appropriate role for the funding and the state and the planning process to take on, is to develop whatever information gaps or information might be needed to fill those gaps. So that's an important principle that I would like to leave everybody with, and just recognize that these are problems of like how much flow can we take out of a stream before we begin to do natural resource damage. Those questions have been addressed in a lot of states. They've been addressed in articulate ways. The science is not perfect, but I just want to impress on everybody, let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good when we come to that point in the planning process, but rather let's put our heads together and figure out solutions. We've done it in other places for other major water challenges, and I think that can be part of a state water plan as well. Another major point that I'd really like to touch on is the infrastructure piece. Yesterday I asked the question about that just to try to keep that point up high, because the infrastructure bill for the nation and for South Carolina is really staggering. And in fact, the projection for the whole nation is on the order of $1 trillion over the next 25 years. So that actually almost makes that $2.2 billion pill over the next 20 for South Carolina to appear relatively palatable. I really want to point out the value of our natural systems in supporting that infrastructure. Too often this has been overlooked, but this is a really emerging area. In some ways emerging, in some ways very old. Actually, the ancient Romans recognized the principles of water coming from forests being cleaner, being more ready to use, being cooler, having all these different attributes that made it more serviceable before anybody tried to do anything with it, just coming right out of the system. And so recognizing that natural pre-filtration value, the steadiness and predictability of delivery of water from natural lands can certainly help us plan much better than the flashy and unpredictable and sudden flows that come off of heavily urbanized areas. So really recognizing those connections, I think, is critical to our water future. And there's been very good work on this, very good examples around the nation. We have a great example right here in South Carolina with the Greenville watershed, which were protected back in the early part of the century or previous century, and the water quality there has remained relatively unchanged from the time that it's been protected. And as great as that scenario is, I don't want to imply or leave the implication that 100% protected scenario is what's needed. It's a continuum. And the work going around the nation in watershed science and the relationship to the costs and provision of potable water and wastewater management is showing that there is a very clear continuum from one end to the other as you go from 100% natural land all the way down to 100% urbanized land. And those ranges can go anywhere from, say, 5 to 7 times the treatment cost implied by a heavily urbanized watershed versus a more natural watershed or a watershed where they've protected key areas. And you apply that 5 to 7 time factor to a $2.2 billion infrastructure cost, and you're looking at something that could inflate that $2.2 billion to $10 billion or $12 billion or $14 billion. So we really need to consider that value, as we go forward. There's been another analysis that was done reviewing systems that have some degree of infrastructure support in their watershed, green infrastructure support, so some amount of protected land, is showing that the value of $1 invested in the green infrastructure side can save up to $27 in treatment costs. So there are very strong relationships emerging that we need to recognize as we go forward in thinking about our water planning and bring that green infrastructure piece forward. We're blessed with an abundance of natural lands in South Carolina still. Those can provide a great support system to that infrastructure cost and assure that that $2.2 billion figure doesn't balloon into something much more frightening. So at that point, I think I'm going to close out my remarks and just leave you with those two major points and try to add that into the conversation. These are things that we can begin to plan for, we can begin to act on. We have good science to identify how to do these things, and so that's what's incumbent upon us as intelligent beings is to bring that science forward and apply the best of our heads before we run into some of these loggerheads that we know are off in the future if we don't use our facilities. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Eric. Dana?
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to be brief. How many times have you heard that said and found out it was a lie? But this won't be a lie because my speech is on my iPhone and it's running out of juice. So I have exactly 5 minutes. I'd like to mention two issues that have been referred to already today that I think ought to be integrated into our water policy, water plan, whatever we call the complex of things that determine how we use water in South Carolina and conserve it. The first is the acknowledgement that water quality and water quantity inexorably and indisputably depend on land use. Heather mentioned that earlier, so did Eric. Watersheds are the physical infrastructure that determine the availability of surface and groundwater. We have not paid enough attention to that in crafting water policies. Simply put, the health of our watersheds determines the health of our streams and our creeks and rivers. It is not to suggest, obviously, that withdrawal and discharge policies are unimportant. They obviously are. It's simply to note that as we deliberate over withdrawals and discharges, it's often too easy to ignore the somewhat more convoluted issues surrounding watersheds, but we cannot do that. In the early 2000s, I wrote a report for the Pew Oceans Commission on development on the coast and its impact on waters of the coastal zone. One of the central themes was when watersheds reach a level of impervious coverage, and it's around 10%, the streams and rivers within those watersheds become quickly degraded. We've paid little attention to that fact, and very much to the detriment of our water bodies, especially on the coast where growth is so rapid and so extensive. The second point I'd like to make is that water is a common resource, obviously. The fact that it's available for virtually no cost whatsoever to anyone who happens to be first in line to take it is illogical and unsustainable. Every speaker today has emphasized the value of water. But what exactly is the value of water according to the state of South Carolina? It is zero. Let me give you an example of the value of water. This bottle of water, mine is empty. My empty bottle is worth nothing. Every aspect of this product costs something except the water in it. The plastic, the cap, the printing, the marketing, the distribution. The only thing in it that costs nothing is the only thing that gives it any value. That is an absurd situation, I think, that we face. It is ironic, I think, also in a state that values a commitment to free markets, that our public policy regarding the use of water nowhere deploys the instrument of markets to impose a level of prudence and discipline on the beneficial use of water. Many states charge a fee for water. California, for example, charges about 5 cents per 1,000 gallons, and that is a state now that literally the world has changed over the last 2 to 3 years with the drought. And they were maybe too late, maybe too late. We aren't too late. Water fees, water charges could also stimulate more creative and innovative technologies to conserve this essential resource. Now, I recognize I'm not naive enough to think that setting a price on water is a simple matter. There are numerous potential pitfalls, there are unintended consequences, but there is no excuse to ignore the reality that when water is taken for private use, it is subtracting an asset from the public balance sheet. On the positive side, a properly crafted fee could be deployed to extremely beneficial purposes. And you've heard today, everyone has said we don't have enough money to manage our water resources. A fee could help us do that. But this also brings me back to my first point. Watersheds, as I said, are the infrastructure of South Carolina's water system. They provide irreplaceable public values, and yet they are virtually all privately owned. The regulation of watersheds, to the extent that there is any, and in most parts of the state there is none, occurs at the county and municipal level. Now, counties and cities are not charged with protecting state resources, and understandably so. Yet they are, on the front line, they are the only ones who apply any level of guidance to the management of watersheds, to the disposition of watersheds. So with that in mind, if South Carolina were to charge a fee for water use, that fee could be deployed to protect private watersheds. Rather than regulating at the state level, the fee could be used to conserve parts of watersheds according to the science that Eric referred to, and we understand very well. And I will want to make one editorial comment. There's a lot of science out there. There is not any dispute about the need to conserve water. There is no dispute about the need to conserve watersheds. We don't need to wait for more studies to decide to move forward. Now, obviously, there's some fine-tuning that needs to be done, but we should not delay in this effort under the guise of waiting for more science. So my suggestion with respect to water policy is this. We acknowledge the indisputable fact that watersheds provide essential services, and specifically in the arena of maintaining sustainable water supplies. That we acknowledge that these watersheds are threatened by development, and all you have to do is look at the newest North Carolina State USGS study of the Southeast to confirm what you already know. And that the instruments of planning for watershed use are only available at the local level where it is not appropriate to use those instruments or effective to preserve a state resource. And so I suggest that we acknowledge that water has immense public economic value, that it's public, as a public asset, it should be integrated into a market-based allocation process, and simply that the state should charge a fee that would be used for many purposes, ranging from infrastructure to planning to watershed protection. Thank you very much for asking me to speak today.
Thank you, Daniel. Hamilton?
The unenviable task of following my boss up after a great few minutes of talking. My name's Hamilton Davis. I direct the energy program at the Coastal Conservation League, which probably makes me the least qualified person on this panel to talk about water. But there is a huge intersection between water and electricity generation, and so that's what I'm going to be focused on for the next few minutes. I know you heard a little bit about this from a utility panel yesterday morning. Some of my utility friends, I see Jeff Penland back there was on that panel, Danny Cassis was here. There might be a little bit of overlap, but I'm seldom confused with a utility spokesperson, so hopefully you'll get a little different perspective. I mean, starting off just looking at where are we getting our power from today? What does our energy portfolio look like in South Carolina? We're getting about 50% of our power from coal, about 27% nuclear, about 20% natural gas, and then the remaining few percentage points comes from renewables, mainly biomass hydro. That's about to shift pretty dramatically in the next 5 years or so when SCNG and Santee Cooper bring on 2 new nuclear plants. We'll see about a third with those resources. And we've got to start thinking about how we're going to comply with things like carbon regulations that have been rolled out from EPA. So there's a good chance we could get to around 10% renewable energy in the next decade, a little over a decade, which brings the question up, do we have renewable resources that can meet that kind of demand? And the answer is quite clearly yes. We've done a good bit of analysis in the state. We understand that the solar resource, the biomass resource, offshore wind is there in abundance. There's new studies that are just rolling out over the last couple of weeks that look at our onshore wind resource and illustrate that we've got a good bit of potential there as well. And then, of course, our cheapest option when it comes to avoiding energy use, energy efficiency, we're about 39th in the country for energy efficiency today, so a lot of opportunity for progress there. When we talk about water usage in the context of generating electricity, we're talking about whether a power plant is withdrawing water for purposes of cooling, which uses a lot of water, in a pass-through system that then goes back into our rivers and our lakes, or you're looking at it as a recirculated system which consumes a lot more water but doesn't withdraw as much from our lakes and rivers. You look at the different kinds of generation that we have online. Natural gas, by far, is the most efficient when it comes to using water. Nuclear is the highest in terms of withdrawal, about 8 times higher than natural gas for withdrawal purposes, about 4 times higher than natural gas for consumption, and then coal, out of all those resources, is highest for consumption, which of course is what we're most heavily reliant on today in South Carolina. To give you some idea of the scale of water withdrawal, water usage when we generate our electricity, in the U.S., each minute, power plants take in about 3 times the amount of water that falls over Niagara Falls each day. It's a lot. You compare the water usage with power plants to other water users. Power plants come in at about 41% of what we use. Ag is below that in the 30s. Drinking water is only about 13%. Industrial use is about 9%, and that's nationwide. If you zoom in on the southeast, you see that power plants withdraw about 40 billion gallons of fresh water each day. That's about 65% of the region's total withdrawal, which puts us well above the national average, and South Carolina falls into that category of being particularly high. If you look at the average family of 4, what do they use each day? Well, it's about 400 gallons. But then if you think about what they require in terms of water based on the electricity they use in their home, you get bumped up to another 600 to 1,800 gallons of water per day. So clearly, the reliance on water when it comes to meeting our electricity needs is fairly high. The challenges are obvious. The stresses we have on our water resources, water availability, all of those are complicated if we have an electricity system that's overly reliant on an intense water usage. In drought conditions, particularly, power plants have to either cut back on their generation or shut down their operations. We've seen some of this around the country and even here in the region. The 2012 drought in the Midwest, utilities, instead of cutting back or shutting down, were allowed to actually just discharge water back into the rivers at higher temperatures. So that's the kind of situation we'd certainly want to avoid, compromising the ecological integrity of our water resources for the sake of keeping the lights on. In 2011, droughts in Texas threatened about 3,000 megawatts of power plant generation in that state. That's about, that would be a significant portion of what we use here in South Carolina. And then back as far as 2007, 2008, the drought we experienced in South Carolina then, we saw impacts on the Duke Energy system up in North Carolina, causing them to cut back power at 2 of their coal plants on the Catawba, as well as creating a lot of uncertainty with some of their nuclear facilities, water levels dropping below or threatening to drop below the water intake valves on those reactors. The other problems we've seen in the region have to do with water coming into a power plant that's too warm for cooling purposes and creating challenges. And then again, water going out of those plants that's too warm, creating ecological issues in the bodies of water that are being served or being used. So it's really a three-part challenge I think we face and that we've got to be talking about. We've got increasing electricity demand, we have increasingly stressed water resources, and then we have to think about how to deal with both of those things in the face of a changing climate. And I think no one in this room is underestimating the level of challenge that really is. Of course, there are mitigation opportunities. There are policy options that we ought to be entertaining. We are entertaining some of them today and beginning to implement them, but there's a lot more that we could be and probably should be doing. There are technological ways to reduce water consumption in power plants, things like cooling towers, but a lot of those technology fixes are expensive and they also compromise some of the efficiency of those plants. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. One of the better ways I would propose that we have to address some of our energy usage for purposes of creating electricity is through energy efficiency. If you look at a study that focused on South Carolina that came out in 2007 from the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, ACEEE, it's definitely worth Googling that study. Very detailed assessment of where we can start avoiding future energy demand over the next decade or so in South Carolina, but also how that impacts our water resources and the level of savings we would see as a consequence of adopting certain policies. Their estimates that if we were to adopt the policies they recommend, in the near term we could avoid something like 300 million gallons per day of withdrawals, and over about a decade that would rise to 1,800 million gallons per day. So fairly significant numbers. Some of those policy recommendations are more focused on the electricity side, things like low-income weatherization programs, manufactured home initiatives, improved building energy codes for the state, and then others are focused on water usage specifically, things like plumbing efficiency standards and conservation pricing of water and sewer service. So where are we really focused? Where are the opportunities, not just within the state water plan, but also in energy policy that we're working on today in South Carolina that are going to enable us to get at this problem maybe from a little bit different direction, but I think could also inform some of these broader conversations that are underway. I think the best news is that we passed landmark solar legislation this year. Utilities, conservation groups, solar advocates came together, were able to find consensus, which is going to be an important part of this process. And the legislature passed that law. Governor Haley signed it into action in June, and we're going to see a lot more solar in South Carolina as a consequence of that. That's people being able to put solar on their rooftops, businesses being able to put it on their rooftops, and then larger scale, utility scale solar developments as well. Part of that law requires us to look at things like net energy metering. What does a utility pay for electricity if you put solar on your rooftop and some of that electricity goes back onto the grid? Well, one of the value categories that we're talking about right now is what's the value of water that's saved, that's avoided when you produce your electricity through solar. We don't have a value right now. It's going to be one of those tough categories to check the box and fill out, but it's certainly, as evidenced by the discussion this week at this conference, a necessary consideration and something we should be thinking about more directly. As I mentioned, we also have the EPA carbon rules that were rolled out earlier this year. I think actually the same day that our solar bill was signed into law, ironically. That law is going to require South Carolina to think very differently about how we get our energy in the future and in a much more carbon constrained way. Part of that answer is going to be through those new nuclear reactors that will be coming online at the end of this decade, but part of it is going to be renewable energy and energy efficiency. So making sure that we have a state implementation plan that complies with the requirements of the EPA, that's balanced between nuclear, renewables, efficiency, and also takes into consideration things like the impacts on our water resources in the state is going to be critical. We've seen a lot of progress, not just on energy usage or reducing energy usage and starting to think about these renewables, but also impacts like coal ash storage and water quality issues associated with that. Santee Cooper is in the process of cleaning up a coal ash pond in Conway. We've got SC&G cleaning up numerous coal ash ponds around the state, and we're well on our way to avoiding the kind of catastrophe that you saw up in North Carolina on the Dan River last year. And of course, we look at that from an environmental, ecological standpoint as being very positive progress. And then finally, we had the DNR climate study that came out last year. So the state finally taking a fairly comprehensive look at what climate change is going to mean for South Carolina from a variety of different perspectives. And certainly that's a great start in beginning to understand how a lot of these issues are going to begin to overlap, the need for comprehensive planning, the need to really stay focused on the changes that are ahead of us in the future and make sure we're preparing for them. And just to echo what I think I've heard a couple times today from some of the panelists, at the end of the day, we've got to avoid this planning paralysis. Obviously, planning is critical to all of this, and we've got to be thoughtful in our actions. But at the same time, we've got to get some of this done sooner rather than later. We don't have a decade to figure out exactly what the next step should be. We got to take what we know, we got to be motivated, and we got to ensure that our legislators have the political will to move forward, and that all the folks in this room and elsewhere are coming to the table with good intent and ready to take the next steps. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Well, I think these were really great comments from both sides. And it was really interesting to begin to hear how our plan is anticipated to unfold. It's interesting to listen to comments about what are some of the concerns from the collective voice that these groups represent. What we'd like to do now, we have about 20 minutes, 25 minutes for questions. So we're going to open the floor for questions, and we would encourage you to come forth and ask those questions that you might have.
Yesterday's session I waited until last, so I'll go first today. I also took notes this time. As a citizen stakeholder, it's difficult to get a holistic grasp of water issues and which agencies control or have authority over various aspects of regulation. As the South Edisto withdrawal registration was happening, it was frustrating to try to get definitive answers because every new question seemed to involve another agency. How to simplify and clarify who's responsible and who to contact with issues and concerns, that's one of my questions. Second, implementation. We've heard a lot about. Mr. Rentiers was kind enough to endure some of my questions yesterday in his session. It's discouraging to know previous water plans have gone unimplemented. So what can we do to avoid this becoming another such situation? And studies and data are great, but how long can we wait before a looming threat becomes an actual crisis, which goes to Hamilton's final point there. And finally, is complexity an absolute necessity in looking for answers here? Are there some simple basic things like protecting minimum in-stream flows, for example, that we can protect in policy in advance of more granular and complete elements of a complete and comprehensive plan? Can we afford to wait for those macro scale items while detailed studies and plans are being made? Thanks.
So we'll let you guys.
I'll be happy.
You're welcome to come up.
Well, actually, I wish I could say that there was another agency you could talk to about surface water withdrawals, but it's DHEC. And you know, I would like to clear up maybe one misconception about the surface water withdrawal decisions that are made. We do talk with DNR quite a bit. And Ken has made his folks available to us as we're looking at withdrawal issues. So I heard some discussions possibly yesterday about there being some type of prohibition, if you will, for DHEC and DNR to work together on withdrawal issues. That's not there. Now, we have prescribed authorities and things that we have to do under the law. And DHEC accepts that responsibility, and we do those. But there's no closed door, there's no wall between DHEC and DNR as we look at these issues. So, again, questions about water withdrawals, DHEC. And I think you had some other questions about the planning process. Ken, I didn't know if you wanted to say anything more on that.
Can you clarify that question, sir? What exactly were you asking about the planning process?
It was kind of a bifurcated question. One was, do we have to have complex answers to this, or can things like minimum in-stream flows be protected in advance of a more detailed plan? And the other part was, how do we get to implementation of a plan by the legislature rather than just seeing it once again go on the shelf without being implemented?
Well, and let me just, on the minimum in-stream flows, those are included in the Surface Water Permitting Act already. So just recognize that that is already there and is being used.
I guess a lot of our concerns would be ag registration side of it, where it seems like there's less.
Understand, there is a different consideration for agricultural withdrawals.
You know, on the question of how do we get this plan implemented, I think the bottom line on that is go back to grassroots politics. Go talk to your representative and senator and make sure they're aware of your concerns. As I mentioned earlier, I think there's a growing recognition in the legislature that we need to address these issues, so we have a pretty good starting point. So I would just recommend engage in the democratic process that we are fortunate to have in this country and go from there.
Ken, a part of his question involved the 2 state water plans that have already been put out by DNR.
Yes, sir.
And what you brought up in your talk earlier was that these plans have kind of been shelved without being implemented. I think part of his question is, how do we implement a plan that hasn't been created when we have plans that are on the shelves that we could be utilizing and building upon?
Well, and you know, I mentioned earlier as well that we have done some of these things piecemeal, but we really have taken that initiative, and a lot of the points in the plan and recommendations do not have any, quote, teeth in them. You know, we're doing some of these things, but I guess my point is that to have a really effective plan, a statewide water plan, it has to have some legal authority behind it, and we haven't had that yet. And I'm hopeful that the excellent product that we expect to come up with will be enough to demonstrate to our legislators that, yes, these make a lot of sense. So we're making some inroads there, but exactly how we're going to do that, that's evolving. You know, it's disappointing that these past 2 plans were not adopted. Some of these things made so much sense that we were able to do them anyway. But the bottom line is we need the legislative support behind it, and we're going to try to keep working on that.
Other questions?
Good morning. My name is Doug Busby, and I'm from down in a little town called Wagner in the Edisto region. And I have no other credentials to put me here other than I was born and raised in the Edisto River. And I love the people of that region, and I love the people of South Carolina. And as you well know, many of you are well aware that we are in a struggle because of a big ag registration. And it brought to light some flaws that are in the surface water law. And I in no way want to villainize the farmer because he is within the law. I know him personally, and he is a good man. But it has brought to light some struggles that we need to face and we need to deal with. And on August the 29th of this year, we had a situation as per DHEC's and DNR's calculations, using their calculations, we had a situation that happened, and we were not in a drought situation yet, but we had a situation where there was 4 times the actual safe yield in the river than actual flow. That means there is the possibility for an ag user to literally pump the river dry. Now, my question to each one of you from EPA and DHEC and DNR, and I have addressed letters to you, to the heads of your agencies, and to continuously address letters to the governor, and many of our people have. We had over 400 people, as Mr. David well knows, in January on the coldest night of the year, and many of them were dealing with busted pipes in their homes. And 400 of us showed up. My question to each of you is, when is your agent going to protect the people and the environment that you're charged with protecting? When is your agency going to stand up to the politicians and say, hey, we got a problem with this law, and let's suspend any future registrations or permits until it is addressed? Because the same law applies to industry. And what we have seen is it over-allocates our water and inflates the amount of water that is actually in the river by as much as 4 times. And keep in mind, we were not in a drought. How many times is it going to inflate the amount of water that is in a river when we are in a severe drought? And it affects every river in the state. So when do y'all plan on standing up and saying, hey, we got a problem, and to our governor?
So could we address that question?
Please.
Good to see you again from a number of months ago. And yeah, we had a very robust discussion on this, and really, you know, the discussion we had back early in the year with all the concerned folks, and it was a very cold night, we got together and did that. You know, it's obviously on a lot of people's mind. I will tell you this, you know, from DHEC's standpoint, and I know folks don't always like to hear this, we're authorized and we're required to follow the law. And we do that. And we do a very good job of that. And we get support where needed from DNR when we do that. You know, if there's going to be changes to how the Surface Water Withdrawal Act is implemented from a what it says standpoint, that's going to have to start with changes to the law. It cannot start at the agency. And I'll just be very, very clear with that. So we implement the law as it's on the books. You know, that law went through a very long process. There was a lot of stakeholder involvement. There was a lot of, it was a 4-year process, and there was a lot of stakeholder involvement even before it got there. There were a lot of voices heard, and so, you know, I imagine that if there's going to be, if there's a change to it, it's going to be that same very, very robust process. But from an agency standpoint, we implement the law.
I would like to move on, and maybe you could have a private discussion with this unless someone else wants to address it. I think the question's good. We just would like to cover a few more questions.
I understand, but I have one more. If you are charged with protecting the people of South Carolina and the environment, is it not up to you to say, hey, lawmakers, this law does not make sense. This will cause a train wreck down the road. Is it not y'all's job? I have no credentials to say that, but you do. And you have the people and the scientists within your departments that can say that. I just wanted to say that.
And we appreciate that comment. One of the things that that David mentioned, and then yesterday was really driven by the legislature, is every voice needs to be heard. And, you know, your group, as you continue to push with the legislature, you know, we wish that you get the response that you're looking for. And that was very, very open yesterday. Everyone on the legislative panel said, tell us your issues. And I'm sure that issue will clearly be resounded. Any other comments before? Do we have another question?
We, Oscar Bradley Eckhoff, we're talking about the impossible, trying to satisfy everybody. That cannot be done. I, as an 87-year-old left-brain scientist who's an expert in the spiritual world, I have a statement of my conclusion that nobody is going to agree with, but I can prove it. All you got to do is talk to me, and maybe I'll remember all the reasons. We, as a species, human species, have reached the point where we kill each other deliberately or else. The or else is, well, have you ever heard of an atomic war?
Thank you. Do we have other questions? Okay.
Good morning. I enjoyed all of your remarks. My name is Joshua Robinson. I'm a water resources engineer. I live and work in Charleston, my hometown. Are we adequately preparing for the threat of sea level rise? And if we're not, what group or what agency do you envision being charged with the task of preparing for that threat? Thank you.
We certainly can have comments on both sides. Yeah.
Well, at DNR, we are doing some studies on sea level rise and coastal change, so we are addressing that issue. Are we actually prepared for it completely? Perhaps not. But some of the discussions about infrastructure, you know, a lot of our water infrastructure on the coast is vulnerable to sea level rise, and even if it's not overtaken by the sea level rise, it makes it more vulnerable in storm events. So hardening and protecting those kind of infrastructure projects is key. So we are studying it, we're paying attention to it, and so the answer is yes, we're addressing that issue. Do we have all the answers? No, but we are looking at it.
Well, my first off-the-cuff answer is no, we're not ready for it, to state the obvious. But I think there's some interesting things underway. Some of the recent droughts with regard to water supply, I think some of the recent droughts had dramatic effects in the Winyah Bay, Waccamaw River area, where some of the water intakes for Georgetown and Grand Strand Water Authority, and I'm sure there are representatives here who could speak to that, there was a lot of concern over salinity reaching those intakes, and that was a drought condition. But the other piece of that is, you know, if you do some projections of how far salt water will come up the rivers with sea level rise, not just looking at the rising level and threatening land-based resources, but how far the salt wedge is going to come up some of the major rivers, it is a concern. And so I think the infrastructure and the placement of the infrastructure is something that has to be addressed as far as water and water use. And like I say, there's in the drought years in the early 2000s, there was, you know, dramatic demonstration of that with some of those water intakes. The second piece of that is something that my colleague Eric Krieger talked about is, you know, it's the idea of coastal resilience, and again, it comes back to some of the natural infrastructure. Right now in South Carolina, it's probably easier to get a seawall built made out of hardened concrete, a vertical seawall with concrete slabs, It's easier to permit that in most cases than it is to permit putting a new reconstructed oyster reef or oyster bank in front of a property that might provide some level of protection against erosion and storm damage. And so I think we can think creatively about the role of natural infrastructure in coastal resilience and protecting coastal investments. And so there's a technology issue there of finding the ways that work, of how can we reconstruct some of these natural features that have been lost. Oysters are very resilient, but our populations in South Carolina are probably at about 20% of what they were historically, or less. In Georgetown County, it's probably around 5%. Beaufort County is doing better, much better. In Charleston County, somewhere in the middle in terms of oysters. Not only are they an economic resource, but very good evidence that healthy oyster populations help stabilize shorelines. But right now, to rebuild an oyster reef with the federal and state permitting, it's actually harder than putting in, a conventional seawall. And so I think, there are a lot of aspects to that, of getting the technology, the art, and the science right, as well as the regulatory side on some of these questions.
Can I? Should I come up?
You can.
So I would certainly agree with Mark that we're certainly not ready for sea level rise. I do think we've got some interesting conversations starting around the state in places like Beaufort, where they've integrated considerations about sea level rise into their comprehensive plan. You've got some work underway in Charleston, the city of Charleston, that's looking at getting more involved in resiliency planning and thinking about infrastructure investments, building codes, et cetera, in light of our changing climate. You've got great entities like the Nature Conservancy doing some of this preliminary work and research that's going to be helpful in thinking about what we should do. And you've got great institutions like South Carolina Sea Grant that has, if you go to their website, a lot of interesting work on what sea level rise is going to mean for South Carolina and some ways to start preparing for it. The good news, as tends to be with South Carolina, we've got some opportunities to start leading from behind. Other cities, counties up and down the East Coast are good ways ahead of us in terms of putting plans together that really do take a comprehensive look at the changes we can expect and how cities can start responding and planning for those. So I think we definitely need a much more visible, focused conversation on what we should be doing on the coast for not just sea level rise, but drought and extreme storm events, extreme rain events, et cetera. And hopefully, as places like Charleston, Beaufort get more serious, we'll see that spread. And certainly, the Conservation League is interested in being an advocate and part of those projects.
Any other comments? We have time for one more question. Well, if there are no more, okay. One more question.
I'm Andy Ferry with Charleston Water System, and I just wanted to go back and focus on what Dana said about funding issues, because it's really, I listened to Ken say, we couldn't get our water plans going. A lot of those things all drive back to lack of money. And it's a really important issue, Dana, that we somehow or another come up with a method to get some funding to help the agencies drive these programs forward. And, extra taxes, whew, boy, the folks that were sitting there yesterday, they're doing this when you do that. Because everybody remembers, if you're my age, you remember years ago there was 1 cent for education. And it was supposed to solve all of our education woes, but it didn't. And so the accountability of that money, once it's raised, once we figure out how to do it, whether it's a small increase on a water bill or maybe a 1/10 of a penny on each bottle of water sold, whatever that method is, then we have to make certain our stakeholders, our publics, know that we are good stewards of that money and that we're using it for what it's designed to be used for. I don't have an answer, but I think Dana made a great point. It's very important, and we somehow as a group need to be talking to our legislators to get them encouraged and give them the support they need to put that type of effort in place. because they, of course, are worried about votes and getting reelected again so they can continue to help us. So we have to support them, get that funding in place so the agencies can do these programs we're talking about. Thank you.
Okay, one more
Could
question.
I make one just
Sure,
response
go
to
ahead.
that? I just could not agree more, and I think also to the earlier question, the cost of responding to these changes are truly, certainly mind-boggling. And the only way we have a prayer to be able to pay for the changes, the types of things we need to do on infrastructure and watershed protection and other long-term investments is to begin to do it now. If we wait, we don't have a chance. And so I think, if you look at New York City's $1.4 billion plan, post-Sandy plan as a resiliency plan, and consider the kind of investments that we've got two options. We can either give up and just say we are not going to maintain these systems and we're not going to maintain public infrastructure, or we can begin to do it immediately and do it incrementally over time. But there's no middle ground where we say we're not going to do it now, we're going to wait 10 years or 20 years.
Thanks. We have time for one quick, brief question.
Thanks. My name is David Ladner from Clemson University. And related to this last comment, I think a useful thing to do would be to compare the cost for some of the targets that we have to other programs that are currently ongoing. Like when we talk about public support and legislative support for things, I think a good case could be made that there's a lot of bang for the buck in some of these programs. So I don't know, I'm curious to know, like, can you think of maybe a first stage, a next step piece of legislation or a piece of funding that we need for a particular target? How much does that cost compared to some other projects that the state is already doing? And my guess is that the cost that we could find that there's a relatively low cost for some of these things compared to other things that we're already engaged in as a state.
Anyone wish to comment on this last question? Comment?
And that's, other than that's a great point. I mean, we will look at that. I got to tell you, and I won't speak for Ken, but we've been, and I almost hate to say this, we've been so excited about getting some money now and how we're going to use that actually forecasting all the costs that might be associated in the future, we haven't gotten there yet. But as we've all recognized, there's going to be future costs, and your idea about comparing it to other costs that the state bears and how those might relate, that's a good idea.
Well, I really appreciate everyone's participation as a panelist. I think this has been a very interesting session. Again, we encourage everyone to do what has been asked of us, to let your voice be heard and to express your interest and participate as we move forward with the water plan. So if we could give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you, and that concludes morning plenary. And the break is outside, and in just a few minutes we'll start the continued dialogue.